Well, firstly, can I add to the Minister's thanks for the opportunity to appear today and to give evidence to this important inquiry. The Minister quite rightly outlined in his statement that it's often at our times of greatest vulnerability and distress that we actually find ourselves at the door of our ED department. And it's at these times that we place our trust and our faith in the hands of the doctors, the nurses, and all healthcare staff who both provide us with appropriate care and treat us with the dignity and respect that we would deserve, to take us past crisis and help us to the correct pathway to recovery. And it's absolutely why I echo the Minister's sentiment of the importance that he attaches to ensuring that we organise healthcare, including unscheduled and emergency health services, in such a way that they deliver safe and effective care at the right place at the right time by people with the right skills and with the proper and within the proper treatment environment for those providing that treatment and care. As Chief Medical Officer, this is a standard that I work towards achieving for all of the people of Northern Ireland. It is what I also expect as a citizen and as a father, as someone who uses the service. It has always been my motivation since I began my career as a junior doctor, treating and caring for patients in acute episodes of ill health, and my own experiences of working as a junior doctor in a busy accident and emergency department. This is also the underlying motivation of all the staff who work right across health and social care, and I echo our thanks and appreciation to all staff that the Minister indicated earlier. I actually applaud the approach of this inquiry in putting patients, staff and the public at its core. That's what we're in the business of doing. We're a system of people providing care to people, and we must at all times listen to our patients and to our staff. They are our guide to the quality of the services that we deliver. And I want to join with ministers, I've said, in expressing our acknowledgement of their dedication, their professionalism, commitment of all staff. They put their patients first, and we must support them as a system in doing so. And they have my heartfelt thanks as well. Most if not all will have had first-hand experience of their commitment and dedication to making this well. And Mr. Chairman, I have no doubt that as this inquiry proceeds, there will be patients who staff at times who may relate to their experiences of poor care. They may have already done so through the contact line this inquiry is established. This is absolutely important because we must continue finding new ways to hear their voices. Patients and staff must be listened to, and I'm committed to ensuring that working with the Chief Nursing Officer, that we as a healthcare system listen to and act on the concerns of patients and staff. I'm committed to ensuring that the health service here in Northern Ireland deals with these issues openly and transparently. I'm also committed to ensuring that we learn from each other in every instance where the care provided is not lived up to what we or others might reasonably expect. That's the quality and path to quality that all of us would wish to draw. We should also acknowledge, however, that the great majority of patients receive good care, and I hope that this will be reflected in the conclusions reached by this inquiry. Mr. Chairman, you've already heard this morning from the Minister some of the challenges facing healthcare provision in terms of the available resources. There is a rising elderly population leading to a rising number of admissions to hospital currently mainly via accident emergency departments and emergency departments. This puts pressure on those departments and on the wider hospital. Coupled with this, as the Minister has indicated, there's the increasing specialisation of medicine and nursing practice, advances in technology, all of which are driving how acute services are provided. In 1999, Sir Cyril Chandler, an eminent physician, commented, "Healthcare used to be simple, ineffective, and relatively safe. It is now highly complex, effective, and potentially dangerous." It is these challenges which at times of great pressure and demand may result in poor patient experience. And we've seen that recently in the RQI inspection reports of the Royal Victoria Hospital Accident Emergency Department. And Mr. Chairman, while these challenges are not unique to Northern Ireland, they are issues that we must tackle in Northern Ireland. And in so doing, we must remember that our goal is to ensure the needs of patients are being met. We must do better. We will do better. The findings of the RQI reports are not acceptable to me or to the vast majority of staff in the health service, or a reflection more generally of the service here in Northern Ireland, and certainly not a service that I would wish to be part of. Such care, as described in elements of that report, diminish each and every one of us. The Minister set out in his opening statement some of the achievements of the health service over the last year, including a 74% reduction in the number of people waiting over 12 hours. And that is a considerable achievement against the backdrop of increasing pressure. And I join with the Minister in paying tribute to all staff who worked hard to deliver this. And needless to say, there's much more we need to do. In the health service last year, there were still over 3,000 people waiting more than 12 hours. And as the Minister said repeatedly, that's 3,000 too many. And that's why the Minister asked the Chief Nursing Officer and myself to lead a regional task group with the explicit target of eliminating avoidable 12-hour people waiting more than 12 hours in our accident and emergency departments this winter, and to substantially improve 4-hour performance over the next 18 months. This work's important. Targets are not the only part of the picture. The true measure is that patients receive the safest and most effective care possible. My priority commitment remains and always was that patient safety comes first. Nothing but nothing overrides that. And this is another reason why I drive to reduce waiting times and improve patient experiences in the Health and Social Care Trust can only be achieved by taking a value-based and improvement science approach, such as we will be in the work that Charlotte and I, working with the leadership of the HSE, are now engaged in. At its heart, this means using the learning from each person's journey to make that pathway better for all. At our recent patient safety conference, the Chief Executive of the Institute of Health Improvement challenged us, and she said, don't fix it for one, fix it for all. And that's what we're currently embarked on, and the work that Charlotte and I, working with the leadership of the health service here in Northern Ireland, will deliver. I can offer my assurance that patient experience, the quality and safety of care will underpin the work of the task group. And Charlotte will also offer her views when she speaks with you later. Mr. Chairman, finally, we must acknowledge that how we deliver healthcare needs to change. It needs to change fundamentally. We can only be successful in overcoming many of the challenges and issues we face by taking a long-term approach of supporting people in caring for themselves better. Systems primarily designed to provide for acute episodic care at the institution of the health service in 1948 are no longer fit for purpose. Those systems must change as the needs of our population change, or they will forever be no longer fit for purpose. Mr. Chairman, there's very much more I could say, but I am conscious of your time, and I think I've already exceeded my 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McBride. I have 2 or 3 short questions. The first one really is, when you went to give evidence yesterday up at the Assembly, you talked about if the issues of resources aren't resolved, this will cause considerably greater pain, and I wonder if you could elaborate what you actually meant by that in the context, for example, of accident and emergency services.
Well, I think that there are a number of aspects of that. I think my evidence to the committee is a matter of record. It was the basis of my previous advice to the Minister when the challenges faced with financial break-even became clear, and some of the decisions that the Minister faced in relation to the use of uncommitted funds. And that's funds that are not on the ground, not delivering services, or not contractually committed. That made us, we were faced with some fairly stark choices. And in my view, many of those stark choices were counter-strategic and would actually, if enacted, would bring about greater inefficiency in the use of resource and less effective care. And 2 examples that I gave at my evidence session, which are in the public domain, were in relation to the pressures on our ED departments. For instance, whilst we've achieved a 44% reduction in people waiting over 12 hours in the last year, we had somewhere in the region of 1,085 people this winter compared to 5,574 in the winter of 11-12. Whilst that marks significant progress, the pressures that the Minister alluded to, the 1.8% increase in A&E attendances, the 6% increase in emergency admissions that we have seen, puts tremendous pressure on the service, on the staff delivering service, and their ability to provide high quality care and good experience of that care. Now, as we move into winter, we plan thoughtfully and methodically for winter, as the trusts are required to do, as is their responsibility to do, and they work very closely with our Health and Social Care Board and Public Health Agency in relation to putting those plans in place to deal with the increased pressures over the winter period. So we had set aside resource to provide additional capacity That might be GP capacity, it might be community nursing capacity, and I'm sure I can speak to that. It may be additional beds, it may be enhanced diagnostics services to smooth the flow of patients, because we do see increased pressures because of winter flu bugs, etc. And obviously, because that money had not yet been committed, that was one of the things that the Minister was considering as to whether or not he could afford to proceed at risk of not breaking even in terms of the budget which had been agreed by the Assembly. Now, to do so, in my view, and as I advised the Minister, would have created even more pressures on already pressurised emergency departments. And as I said to the committee yesterday, I could neither recommend to Minister such decisions nor indeed support the implications of such decisions. Similarly, in relation to access to a range of NICE approved drugs, so this is the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. These are drugs which are proven to be cost effective and clinically effective, so it's not just a matter of clinical effectiveness, that actually the use of these drugs is cost effective in terms of preventing complications, in terms of the cost of treating the complications. We, in Northern Ireland back in 10-11, had somewhere in the region of 393 people waiting more than 3 months to start disease-modifying drugs to treat their rheumatoid arthritis. Totally unacceptable. That's people waiting in pain, in suffering, in distress, at risk of further disease progression. Now again, because there were pressures in the system, the Minister, looking at uncommitted funds, was faced with a decision. And we are still faced with that decision. Do we proceed to stop the monies to allow people to access drugs that are clinically and cost effective? Do we build up a waiting time, as we did have in 10-11, or does the Minister highlight those concerns as he did to his executive colleagues, and also he highlighted at the Health Committee yesterday? Obviously, in all of this, there are difficult challenges, and these are challenges that are faced with health economies right across the world. The challenge between balancing the resources available in a constrained financial and economic environment, the increasing demand for services driven by demography and an aging population. You know, we have, in the next decade, there will be 26% of the population here in Northern Ireland be over 65 years of age. In the context of ED departments, that's very relevant, because 20% of all attendances to our accident and emergency departments are over the age of 65, and 45% of them ended up being admitted. You know, in the next decade, 50% of our population in Northern Ireland will be over the age of 85. As a matter of fact, we have the fastest growing elderly population in any part of the United Kingdom. So we need to plan for the long term, and we need to make sure, as the Minister has said, that we have models that are fit for providing a different model of care. And certainly the concerns are that we continue to change the service in the way that the Minister has described, to have a service which is less dependent on acute episodic care, less dependent on our accident and emergency departments being the front door or gateway into hospital, but more alternative models which support and inform self-management, the use of technology to support patients to care for themselves, better use of our social services and a range of other services to keep people in their own homes, and only to admit people to hospital if indeed their care and support in the community is not appropriate or puts them at an increased risk and they need a short episode of inpatient care, and then as quickly as possible to re-enable that person to get back into a productive life in the community. Now that's the journey that we're on. That's the journey that's outlined, and Professor Hunt referred to it earlier in terms of transforming your care. That won't happen today, it won't happen tomorrow, it won't happen this winter. It's a 3 to 5 year journey. It's a journey that all health systems right across this world are struggling with in terms of continuing to meet the growing needs of an aging population, the costs associated with new technology, and at the same time change how we do the service. There was an interesting, it always reminds me of an interesting ad, I think it was for an insurance company, and it's called Flying Airplanes in the Sky. And it shows a plane being assembled as that plane is flying. So it shows men with parachutes and hang gliding down with seats, bolting on, panels onto the fuselage of a plane. And that's what we're doing. We're continuing to provide health and social care to meet the growing needs of the health population here in Northern Ireland, and at the same time trying to transform that, trying to introduce innovation, smarter ways of working, better support to people in their own homes and their own community. And that takes time and it takes resource, but ultimately we will save resource in terms of more efficient and more effective use of resource.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of time, so I'll ask one other question about a very quick comment, and perhaps then my second question. One of the issues that strikes me about transforming your care is the transitioning arrangements in including resources. And I wonder if you'd comment briefly on how confident you are that we will be able to manage the transition to get where we want to go. I think the direction of travel is very clear in the Compton report. Whether people are confident we can get there, I think, might be another matter. But if you'd say something briefly on that. But the other question I want to ask very quickly is just on the task force. And what do you see as the kind of non-resource priority issues for you in the piece of work which you and your colleague Charlotte Picardo will be overseeing?
Okay. Briefly, I think that am I confident there is no alternative? If, as I said earlier in my opening comments, the health service was designed in 1948. It was designed for once-in-a-lifetime acute episodic care, dependent on people making multiple contacts with it until we got the diagnosis right and they got their treatment. It can no longer be like that. Changing population, elderly population, more long-term conditions means that big drivers in the future for health service are prevention and our new public health framework, Making Life Better, that cross-government approach in terms of how we improve the health of the population, keep the population healthier for longer. And there is evidence, if we had time, in terms of progress we're making there, in terms of differences in increasing life expectancy. The other big aspect of this is how we're going to manage long-term conditions. And in the Transforming Your Care makes clear the direction of travel. There are no alternatives. It is a must deliver. It is a must do. Otherwise, the current model of care will continue to struggle to deliver. Now, is it a challenge? Of course it is. I mean, I would draw the Commission's attention to a recent report by the Nuffield Trust, Into the Red, which looked at how the health service in England was dealing with the dual challenges of constrained resources and at the same time seeking to deliver a different model of care. I could list any number of countries who are similarly facing similar challenges. So that is the blueprint. And what we need to do is ensure that transforming care, as I said at the committee yesterday, it isn't a shiny green document that sits on a shelf in the department or Linen Hall Street. It actually becomes embedded in terms of the day-to-day practice of every doctor, every nurse, every social worker, every allied health professional, every porter, everyone else who is a caregiver, in terms of looking at opportunities to work better, to work differently, to work smarter, to work in a more integrated way, blurring the boundaries between what happens in community care, in primary care, and hospital care. Because whilst we have had an integrated healthcare system here in Northern Ireland since 1973, people at times see the joins. As a patient, as a user of service, I want seamless care. I don't want to see joins. I don't need to know who does what, but I want to know that care is there when I need it, and it's the appropriate level of care. I don't want to get into hospital or go into hospital when I don't need to be in hospital. So there is confident. I would not underestimate the scale of the challenge, and it is about building airplanes as you fly. In terms of resources, yes, non-resource dependent aspects that are hugely important. I think culture. I think it's a belief it can be done. I read a book recently by John McDonough about the introduction of the Affordable Care Act in the US. And he was explaining how he got different political parties together to unite around the need for the Affordable Care Act to drive fundamental change in healthcare in the US. And there was a quote in the book which said, from a senator who said, "The greatest challenge of all was overcoming the belief it couldn't be done." And I think that in terms of non-resource challenges, that will be one, to ensure that we have the hearts and minds of all involved in delivering healthcare, frontline staff, those managing services who actually believe this can be done and are actually working in an integrated way. An integrated way, as the Minister described, which is motivated by the principles of highest principles of public work, those working in public life and professionalism, working in the interests of patients and the public.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. And there's already been discussion about you and your colleague leading the task force on emergency care, and I've just got a couple of questions about that, if I may.
Yes.
One, could you just clarify for me or for us, please? Are you charged with implementation of the RQIA's report of April 2014 and the RQIA's report of July 2014, or is it just the latter? It's a rather dull point, but I need to get it clear. I don't know if you want to ask that right away before I go on to my other questions. Is my question clear? Perhaps not.
Yes,
Yeah.
and yes on behalf of the department, and our role varies in terms of both the two elements.
Okay.
If you wanted me, I'm happy to explain the difference.
Okay,
in role.
but you have some responsibility for the recommendations in relation to both reports.
Yes,
Okay.
the first report in relation to the specific report on the Belfast Trust, that is about myself and Charlotte under the aegises of the coordinating group,
Right.
holding to account the organisation for delivery against
Right.
those recommendations.
Right.
So that's an accountability arrangement between a department
Right.
and its arm's length body, but enjoined in that will be the Commissioner of those services, the Health and Social Care Board, supported by the Public Health Agency. The latter, in relation to the wider piece of work, the system piece of work and the associated elements that we will be taking forward, is the senior leadership of the HSC. The existing accountabilities in the system pertain, and we are simply coordinating that, but actually making sure that there is a strong, between Charlotte and myself, Ace and Sean Holland, who's our senior social service colleague within the department, a strong sense of professional ownership
Right.
over that.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And could you explain, please, how you, or elaborate, because you've touched on it, elaborate a little on how you plan to monitor progress towards implementation of the RQI recommendations? And if I may go on briefly, whether, when reading the RQIA recommendations in relation to the April 2014 report, I was really struck by something. I was struck by the group of recommendations calling for more support for staff.
Yeah.
More participation of staff in the organisation of the emergency department. And I won't go through them all, but I was sort of amazed by recommendation 11. It's recommended that regular staff meetings are held for staff working in the ED department. I mean, I was sort of quite astonished that that needed to be recommended. I'm glad that it's there. I'm not knocking the report. It's just a pity that it has to be stated as such. And there was a recommendation that ED staff should be involved in planning of the new department. It's recommended staff should be supported to ensure appropriate care and privacy is given and that patients are treated with dignity. I mean, they're all spot on. But it was very revealing, wasn't it, that I thought that they had to be recommended. I'm really pleased that they're in there, and I think this underlining of support for staff is critically important. And a human rights-based approach to health encompasses the rights and interests of patients, carers, families, but also the rights and interests of staff. And I've got no illusions about a human rights-based approach to health. It's not a panacea.
No, absolutely isn't.
It's not a panacea, and there aren't any neat fixes to these immensely complicated problems. However, I respectfully suggest that a human rights-based approach can help to ensure staff's rights and interests are protected, can help to ensure there is appropriate participation in management, help to ensure that staff get and enjoy good terms and conditions of work. So I'm interested to know whether or not you are open in the work of your task force in the work of your task force to bring a human rights-based lens to the recommendations and to your work. I might add, in keeping with the UK's international obligations. And if I may just go on a little more, because I'm interested, and you've touched on it, sir, so that's one reason why I'm picking it up. It's this issue of governance. And you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but Compton, I think, a really powerful report, very light on governance, which means Sir Liam Donaldson's work is doubly important. Now, from a human rights-based approach, governance is more than safety of patients.
Absolutely, it is.
It's about transparency, it's about public participation,
Absolutely,
about
yeah.
patient participation,
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
staff participation.
Yes.
And with all this stuff can engender community ownership, better at least community ownership, which can help deal with some really difficult budgetary decisions that in this world of finite budgets have got to be made. And it seems to me that governance, health governance, also includes not just transparency, public participation, safety of patients, but also independent review, which is, as I understand it, provided to a considerable degree by RQIA presently. So my question is, what do you understand by health governance? Is it just safety of patients?
No, absolutely it isn't. There are many, governance is a multifaceted. There are everything from corporate governance in terms of how an organisation sets its aims and objectives, and in the case of the HSE, it takes that from the department in terms of the policies, the standards that we set, the appointment of the accounting officers, the chief executives within the trust, the assurances that the PermSec, who's the accounting officer within the department, seeks in relation to the understanding of their role and their responsibilities, the role and responsibilities of the boards of those organisations who are ultimately accountable for the operational running of those organisations and ensuring that those organisations deliver against the standards that we set, deliver on the priorities that we as a department set, meet the legislative requirements, the statutory requirements that we as a government, as a department set. And indeed through a system of delegated accountability, because we have a statutory duty to provide an integrated health and social care system, to improve the health of the population, to provide a range of health services, and we delegate that through our arm's length bodies, and in the case of the basis of the inquiry today, largely through our 5 health and social care trusts. We set the standards, we set the targets, we put in place the enabling legislation, and I'll come on to the human rights legislation in that context, and then those services are directed through the commissioning plan direction to the Health and Social Care Board and Public Health Agency to commission those services from the trusts, supported by the indicators of performance that the Minister alluded to, specifically in relation to ED, in terms of things we would wish to see as measures of success. And then we hold the system to account. The board has its specific accountabilities for performance and service improvement. The Public Health Agency has its responsibilities in terms of public health improvement, reducing health inequalities, health protection, and we, the department, then hold the system to account, deliver against those. Now, in terms of the specifics of a human rights-based approach, 2 things. I think human rights-based approach applied in the proper context and the proper way merits consideration. However, a word of caution. And my word of caution is that often, in my experience and from my reading of the literature as well, it's how it's applied. Often there can be a view taken that a rush to a legislative solution or a statutory solution or instrument is actually a panacea, and I know that's not the point that you're making, but applied in the correct means with the appropriate and supportive infrastructure and understanding, then I think it merits consideration. In relation to vehicles for so doing, I mentioned earlier the new public health framework, which is signed off by the executive, by all executive departments and ministers to bring about improvements in the health of the population. Very much a life course approach based on the work of Sir Michael Marmot, WHO Health 2020. And indeed, we had WHO helped inform and develop that document, which is all about disease prevention. In the course of that work, we also identified the need to review our public health legislation. Our health legislation was last reviewed in Northern Ireland in 1967. And it still has a very much an infection-based approach opposed to an all-hazard-based approach. And obviously in doing that, we will also need to consider whether or not legislation which was enacted in 1967 still adequately and appropriately reflects the Human Rights Act. We've hosted just at the end of last year the first international first international legal, it was a first international health event for lawyers working in respective jurisdictions right across the world. So we had speakers from the US, from Sweden, Finland, Norway, and that very much has informed the Minister's decision back towards the middle of August of last year to invite the Human Rights, or the Law Commission, to review and consider a piece of work looking at the fitness for purpose of our current public health legislation. That piece of work is just commenced, and undoubtedly in the next mandate, subject to executive approval, we will be taking forward new public health legislation, which most certainly will have to reflect on a range of considerations, and I think in particular the Human Rights Act and the implications for that for public health, for some of the difficult choices and decisions that we talked about earlier and got played out at the Health Committee yesterday. Just trying to remember your final question then. So in terms of principles, yes, I think they merit consideration. Governance, I think I've covered. You mentioned something particular in relation to the implementation of the findings of the RQI review, which I think I briefly summarised. I'm not sure if there was more detail on that you wanted to come back to.
I'm just conscious of time, but my question was about how you propose to monitor progress
Sure.
towards those recommendations.
Yes, well, we have set up, I don't want to go into jargon and process, but as you know, governance and accountability is hugely important because recommendations can be recommendations, and without action, that's all they are. So we have an agreed mechanism and accountability arrangement working between the department, the board, the agency, and the trusts, which is captured in a program initiation document, which we'll happily share with you in terms of those program structures and arrangements. Basically, as a system, we will be holding each other to account for delivery against the recommendations within the RQI report. The work will be populated and taken forward in work streams, which will be co-chaired, making sure that we're using the experience and expertise of those currently in the system. Those work streams will be supported by what I like to think of as a sort of a affiliation of experts in their field to develop particular models which we will take forward at scale across Northern Ireland, for instance, for the frail elderly, for people with respiratory conditions, which are again two of the particular recommendations within the RQI review. I'd say supported by a project support team, which will have informatics, which will have clinical expertise, colleagues from the College of Emergency Medicine, consultant colleagues, colleagues from the RCN, and Charlotte can talk more about that, with nursing expertise in emergency care, and a series of other work streams as well. But underpinning all of that will be our vitally important strands of work. Finance, in terms of resource, i.e. money resource, stakeholder engagement, and absolutely vital to that is how we engage with the public and users of service. And that work is under consideration and development at present. And actually wider workforce engagement. Now, obviously, the College of Emergency Medicine, RCN, would be core partners. But again, we need to ensure that we give thoughtful consideration to the role of a range of other organisations, Patient Client Council, the Regulation Quality Improvement Authority. How, for instance, those who are expert in the report, and indeed we have secured the input of those who were involved in providing expert into the RQI report to act as critical friends to us as we proceed towards implementation, who challenge and task us with whether we're actually meeting up to what was meant behind the recommendation. Not so that we can tick a box and say recommendation met, but actually that this is what we really meant and no, you haven't done it, or yes, you really have. And then I would hope that we can begin to design a different model of care for a range of conditions for the population of Northern Ireland. So certainly I have no doubt in Charlotte's commitment, my commitment to this. I have absolutely no doubt in colleagues within the Belfast Trust commitment to address the issues. I was hugely impressed by their engagement with staff in terms of dealing with and addressing and engaging with RQI to hear those messages that they needed to hear about how staff were feeling in the service. I think that gives me confidence in terms of the culture within the organisation to effect the change. I don't underestimate the challenges. We've had now 2 meetings of the Regional Coordinating Group. We've had a major workshop. We're populating the work streams, and we will be working in the interest of the population of Northern Ireland, the population and the public that we serve, to ensure that we deliver on the task that the Minister has set us. We cannot have some of the experiences that were recounted in the RQI review or played out in public being repeated. It's just not acceptable.
At some point, we could have that document setting out the accountability arrangements in relation to the RQIA recommendations. That would be brilliant.
Well, certainly.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Pass you to Marion, who will complete the question.
Dr. McBride, I have only 2 questions. I'm sure you'll be pleased to know.
I'm pleased to know that, yes.
The first one is on mortality and morbidity.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could outline the review process in operation across trusts in respect of mortality and morbidity, with particular reference to emergency care departments and the use that the department was going to make of such data.
Yeah, I think that obviously I don't need to remind the committee of the history behind all of this in terms of the origins of the concerns around our processes across the UK for death certification, the shortcomings that were highlighted in the Luce report, the Home Office report, and the failure of those arrangements at that time to detect Harold Shipman and his activities. The Luce report concluded that the system for death certification right across the UK at that time, some years ago, was not fit for purpose. And again, as is in the other jurisdictions, we have engaged in a significant piece of work to absolutely ensure a more robust arrangement. We've worked with the Department of Environment, which is responsibility for crematoria. We've worked with the Registrar General's Office, which is part of DFP, and ourselves in health. Again, working on behalf of the HSC to look at how we can bring about improvements in the robustness of that. And there's a catalogue of examples of good practice which we put in place, and I can provide that in evidence rather than go through that in detail today. We are currently engaged in the second phase of that work, which is to consider the option of moving to appoint a medical examiner to add an additional level of scrutiny to death certification. But I think the specific element of work that you're alluding to, which was in the Minister's statement of the 8th of April, was in relation to enhanced morbidity and mortality review process. I mean, there has been long a history, and an appropriately a history, of when there are deaths from which there may be learning for the teams involved in the care to examine all aspects of the care to ensure that learning is found and that it's disseminated. And yes, we've become much better at that in terms of, since 2003 here in Northern Ireland, putting a well-recognised process for so doing in terms of root cause analysis of incidents, for instance. This takes it to a different level. And again, it builds on work which the Belfast Trust initiated and piloted, and indeed work that is ongoing in the Southern Trust, where to bring an added degree of scrutiny and indeed to comply with Section 7 of the 1959 Coroners Act, where there's a duty not only on medical practitioners to report deaths to the coroner that require in a range of circumstances, and I could list them, but interest of time won't, but in terms of circumstances which require investigation. The Trust put in place arrangements to ensure enhanced scrutiny and an IT-based system which ensured that death certificates were completed in a timely manner, and were updated as necessary when additional information came to light, as it often does when you look into a patient's death and there may be a need to provide additional information to the coroner, or indeed in circumstances where there was a need to disseminate across the organisation the learning identified from those deaths. The Southern Trust has a similar system in place, and indeed the Belfast Trust work very closely with the coroner's office in terms of, we now have a medical certificate of cause of death which is electronically based. I have to say, nowhere else in the UK does this. This is something we are doing in Northern Ireland, which is significantly in advance of what's happening in the rest of the UK. Now, the plan, as outlined by the Minister, was to roll this out in a phased way across Northern Ireland so that every hospital death will be considered in a morbidity and mortality review, not because there may be something wrong or someone has been caused harm, but to identify learning, because, again, that's the big misconception about the serious adverse incident process here in Northern Ireland, where somehow or other something's recorded as a serious adverse incident, that means something happened that shouldn't have happened. No. What it is a sign of a learning organisation, a learning team that's identified that there may be something in the patient's care from which we could learn, and we need to investigate the circumstances to find if there is any learning. There are other systems in place. Now, turning back to the rollout of the morbidity and mortality system, obviously, again, that's subject to resource. We have a working group established. Again, it will be considering the work of the Belfast Trust and the Southern Trust. And again, we will be taking that across government, working with colleagues in the Registrar General's office, the Coroner's office, to ensure that in as far as is possible, that we are confident in the robustness of the arrangements of the appropriate referral of death to the coroner, the appropriate investigation by the coroner, because ultimately, as Chief Medical Officer, it's an important source of data for me. It provides me with information on the major causes of death, morbidity and mortality in Northern Ireland. In terms of my advice to Minister, and indeed to other ministers across government in terms of what we should be doing to address the major causes of morbidity, it informs my priorities. It informs the things where we should be targeting resource, whether that's in cardiovascular disease, whether it's in cancers, or a range of other conditions. So it's hugely important. I could go on at length, but I'm conscious of your time and elaborate. But
Just covered it. My final question is, to what extent is emergency care meeting the needs of vulnerable groups such as the mentally ill or children or those with communication problems, and how are the views of their representatives used to improve the quality of the provision of emergency care to such individuals?
I suppose, and Charlotte will probably want to comment in more detail on this as well, but we had patient and client experience requirements since 2007 in Northern Ireland. That became a statutory requirement in 2009, was enshrined in legislation in the Reform Act at the time of the second phase of the review of public administration here in Northern Ireland. So there is a requirement on all organisations providing health and social care to put in place arrangements to monitor their both engagement with patients, clients, users of service, to engage with patients, clients and user services in terms of changing of the service. And I don't want to stray into areas which Charlotte can expand upon later, so I'll keep my comments brief on this. But they have patient and public engagement panels within all the organisations. They use that to inform their decisions about whether they're measuring up against those standards. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we specifically allude in the commissioning plan direction to the Commissioners of Service, which then informs the trust delivery plans that they must reflect and describe how they're meeting those specific standards. And trusts do so in quarterly reports to the VHA. But Charlotte can elaborate on that a little later. In terms of specific needs, you're absolutely right. Attending an A&E department, an emergency department at a weekend when 8 or 10 attendances are alcohol, really can be a scary experience for people. It can be particularly traumatic experience if you have a mental health problem, and often is not the best place for individuals with mental health problems. All trusts have in place arrangements between primary care and mental health response teams to determine whether or not someone needs an immediate assessment by the mental health team, which then will happen, whether someone needs a mental health assessment with an intervention within 2 hours, or whether someone can be safely managed out back into the community and asked to make appropriate contact with their mental health team in due course. Now, obviously, a great deal of work has gone on within any departments. I mean, the Minister made an interesting observation earlier about those working, and doctors and nurses and social workers, everyone else, I would include in this, being the last generalists. It's hugely important that as a system, we ensure that those working in the front line as gatekeepers have a range of skills and competencies to meet the needs of a broad range of client groups. So indeed, there has been a programme of work with staff working in emergency departments to ensure that they are competent in that assessment and the appropriate management of patients with mental health needs. Another example maybe I would take, because again time short, would be in terms of those foreign nationals entrants to Northern Ireland. The Belfast Trust, who I know you will be taking evidence from later, are responsible for Northern Ireland Regional Interpreter Service. I think there's somewhere in the region of 485 interpreters who are all trained to level 3, most at level 4, covering I think some 40-odd languages. That's widely disseminated. There's training for GPs, for instance, in terms of how to access that service. It's in the undergraduate curriculum for doctors, and I'm sure also for nurses in Queen's University. And indeed, that service is available readily to patients who might present it perhaps where English is not their first language. Similarly, there's a range of work with Roma community, specialist services which we've put in place both in East Belfast and other parts of Belfast, working also very closely with the community sector organisations in Bryson House, for instance, and elsewhere. So I think that in terms of people with learning disability, equally, Equal Lives wasn't a document that sat on a shelf either. The work of Bamford is about ensuring that everyone has equal access to health and social care services which are sensitive to their needs when they need them. Do we get it right all the time? No, I don't think we do. And I think that's why the work that the Minister alluded to, and Charlotte, I'm sure, and Public Health Agency colleagues will talk to in due course, around hearing from the needs of both people generally who use our service, but also specific groups. That's why we have a very strong patient advocacy group established in legislation in 2009, the Patient Client Council. I'm sure you'll have the opportunity to look at some of their reports, their recent reports, for instance, in relation to pain services in Northern Ireland, the reports into patients' experiences of primary care services, etc. So I think we, both because we are required to in legislation, but more importantly, I think because culturally we know that's the right thing to do, we do go to every effort and make every effort to ensure that we're reflecting the views and hearing from the views of those who are actually using our service in Northern Ireland. And that has to be the entire population of Northern Ireland. It cannot be just those that are most articulate and most able to communicate their views.
Thanks very much, Dr. McBride.
Dr. McBride, thank you. Thank you for your fulsome answers to the questions and your candor.